The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
They was fetching a very nice-looking old gentleman along, and a nice-looking younger one, with his right arm in a sling. And my souls, how the people yelled and laughed, and kept it up! But I didn't see no joke about it, and I judged it would strain the Duke and the King some to see Annie. I reckoned they'd turn pale. But no, nary a pale did they turn. The Duke he never let on he suspicioned what was up, but just went a goo-gooing around, happy and satisfied, like a jug that's googling out buttermilk. And as for the King, he just gazed and gazed down sorrowful on them newcomers like it give him the stomach ache in his very heart to think there could be such frauds and rascals in the world. Oh, he done it admirable. Lots of the principal people gathered round the King to let him see they was on his side. That old gentleman that had just come looked all puzzled to death. Pretty soon he begun to speak, and I see straight off he pronounced like an Englishman. Not the King's way, though the King's was pretty good for an imitation. I can't give the old gent's words, no, I can't imitate him, but he turned around to the crowd and says, about like this:
"This is a surprise to me which I wasn't looking for, and I'll acknowledge, candid and frank, I ain't very well fixed to meet it and answer it. For my brother and me has had misfortunes. He's broke his arm, and our baggage got put off at a town above here last night, in the night by mistake. I am Peter Wilkes's brother Harvey, and this is his brother William, which can't hear nor speak, and can't even make signs to amount to much, now's he's got only one hand to work them with. We are who we say we are, and in a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove it. But up till then I won't say nothin' more, but go to the hotel and wait."
So him and the new dummy started off, and the King he laughs and blethers out,
"Broke his arm! Very likely, ain't it? And very convenient, too, for a fraud that's got to make signs and ain't learnt how. Lost their baggage. That's mighty good. And mighty ingenious under the circumstances."
And so he laughed again, and so did everybody else, except 3 or 4, or maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor. Another one was a sharp-looking gentleman, with a carpet-bag of the old-fashioned kind made out of carpet stuff, that had just come off of the steamboat and was talking to him in a low voice, and glancing towards the King now and then and nodding their heads. It was Levi Bell, the lawyer that was gone up to Louisville, and another one was a big rough husky that come along and listened to all the old gentleman said, and was listening to the King now. And when the King got done, this husky up and says,
"Say, looky here, if you are Harvey Wilkes, when did you come to this town?" "Day before the funeral, friend," says the King. "But what time of day?" "In the evening, about an hour or two before sundown." "How'd you come?" "I come down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati." "Well, then, how'd you come to be up at the Point in the morning in a canoe?" "I warn't up at the Point in the morning." "It's a lie." Several of them jumped for him, begged him not to talk that way to an old man and a preacher. "Preacher be hanged! He's a fraud and a liar. He was up at the Point that morning. I live up there, don't I? Well, I was up there, and he was up there. I see him there. He come in a canoe, along with Tim Collins and a boy." The doctor, he up and says, "Would you know the boy again if you was to see him, Hines?" "I reckon I would, but I don't know. Why, yonder he is now. I know him perfectly easy." It was me he pointed at. The doctor says, "Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple is frauds or not, but if these two ain't frauds, I am an idiot, that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here till we've looked into this thing. Come along, Hines. Come along, the rest of you. We'll take these fellows to the tavern and affront them with the other couple, and I reckon we'll find out something before we get through." It was nuts for the crowd, though maybe not for the King's friends, so we all started.
It was about sundown. The doctor he led me along by the hand, and was plenty kind enough, but he never let go my hand. We all got in a big room in the hotel, and lit up some candles, and fetched in the new couple. First the doctor says, "I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds, and they may have complices that we don't know nothing about. If they have, won't the accomplices get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It ain't unlikely. If these men ain't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove they're all right. Ain't that so?" Everybody agreed to that. So I judged they had our gang in a pretty tight place right at the outstart. But the king he only looked sorrowful, and says, "Gentlemen, I wish the money was there, but I ain't got no disposition to throw anything in the way of a fair, open, out-and-out investigation of this miserable business. But alas, the money ain't there. You can send and see if you want to." "Where is it, then?" "Well, when my niece give it to me to keep for her, I took and hid it inside of the straw tick of my bed, not wishing to bank it for the few days we be here, and considering the bed a safe place, we not being used to niggers, and supposing 'em honest, like servants in England. The niggers stole it the very next morning after I went downstairs, and when I sold 'em I hadn't missed the money yit, so they got clean away with it. My servant here can tell you about it, gentlemen." The doctor and several said, "Shucks!" and I seen nobody didn't altogether believe him. One man asked me if I see the niggers steal it. I said no, but I see them sneaking out of the room and hustling away, and I never thought nothing, only I reckon they was afraid they had waked up my master and was trying to get away before he made trouble with them. That was all they asked me. Then the doctor whirls on me and says, "Are you English too?" I says yes, and him and some others laughed, and says, "Stuff!" Well, then they sailed into the general investigation, and there we had it, up and down, hour in, hour out, and nobody never said a word about supper, nor ever seemed to think about it, and so they kept it up, and kept it up, and it was the worst mixed-up thing you ever see. They made the king tell his yarn, and they made the old gentleman tell his'n, and anybody but a lot of prejudiced chuckleheads would have seen that the old gentleman was spinning truth and the other one lies. And by they had me up to tell what I knowed. The king he give me a left-handed look out of the corner of his eye, and so I knowed enough to talk on the right side. I begun to tell about Sheffield, and how we lived there, and all about the English Wilkses, and so on. But I didn't get pretty fur till the doctor begun to laugh, and Levi Bell, the lawyer, says, "Set down, my boy. I wouldn't strain myself if I was you. I reckon you ain't used to lying. It don't seem to come handy. What you want is practice. You do it pretty awkward." I didn't care nothing for the compliment, but I was glad to be let off anyway. The doctor he started to say something, and turns and says, "If you'd been in town at first, Levi Bell," the king broke in and reached out his hand and says, "Why, is this my poor dead brother's old friend that he's wrote so often about?" The lawyer and him shook hands, and the lawyer smiled and looked pleased, and they talked right along a while, and then got to one side and talked low, and at last the lawyer speaks up and says, "That'll fix it. I'll take the order and send it, along with your brother's, and then they'll know it's all right." So they got some paper and a pen, and the king he set down and twisted his head to one side, and chawed his tongue, and scrawled off something. Then they give the pen to the Duke, and then for the first time the Duke looked sick, but he took the pen and wrote. So then the lawyer turns to the new old gentleman and says, "You and your brother please write a line or two and sign your names." The old gentleman wrote, but nobody couldn't read it. The lawyer looked powerful astonished and says, "Well, it beats me," and snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket, and examined them, and then examined the old man's writing, and then them again, and then says, "These old letters is from Harvey Wilkes,
And here's these two handwritings, and anybody can see they didn't write them."
The king and the duke looked sold and foolish, I tell you, to see how the lawyer had took them in.
"And here's this old gentleman's handwriting, and anybody can tell easy enough he didn't write them. Fact is, the scratches he makes ain't properly writing at all. Now here's some letters from—" The new old gentleman says, "If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother there, so he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine." "Well," says the lawyer, "this is the state of things. I've got some of William's letters, too. So if you'll get him to write a line or so, we can come—" "He can't write with his left hand," says the old gentleman. "If he could use his right hand, you would see that he wrote his own letters and mine, too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand." The lawyer done it, and says, "I believe it's so, and if it ain't so, there's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before, anyway. Well, 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 I thought we was right on the track of a solution, but it's gone to grass partly. But anyway, one thing is proved. These two ain't either of them Wilkses," and he wagged his head towards the king and the duke. Well, what do you think? That mule-headed old fool wouldn't give in then. Indeed he wouldn't. Said it warn't no fair test. Said his brother William was the cussedest joker in the world, and hadn't tried to write. He see William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen to paper, and so he warmed up and went warbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying himself. But pretty soon the new gentleman broke in and says, "I've thought of something. Is there anybody here that helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying?" "Yes," says somebody. "Me and Ab Turner done it. We're both here." Then the old man turns toward the king and says, "Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast." Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd a squished down like a bluff bank that the river has cut under, it took him so sudden. And mind you, it was the thing that was calculated to make most anybody squish to get fetch such a solid one as that without any notice, because how was he going to know what was tattooed on the man? He whitened a little. He couldn't help it, and it was mighty still in there, and everybody bending a little forwards and gazing at him. Says I to myself, now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no more use. Well, did he? A body can't hardly believe it, but he didn't. I reckon he thought he'd keep the thing up till he tired them people out, so they'd thin out and him and the Duke could break loose and get away. Anyway, he set there. Pretty soon he begun to smile and says, It's a very tough question, ain't it? Yes, sir, I can tell you what's tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin, blue arrow. That's what it is. And if you don't look close, you can't see it. Now, what do you say, hey?" Well, I never see anything like that old blister for clean out-and-out cheek. The new old gentleman turns brisk towards Ab Turner and his pard, and his eye lights up like he judged he got the king this time, and says, "There, you heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes's breast?" Both of them spoke up and says, "We didn't see no such mark." "Good," says the old gentleman. "Now, what you did see on his breast was a small, dim P and a B, which is an initial he dropped when he was young, and a W, with dashes between them, so P-B-W. And he marked them that way on a piece of paper. Come, ain't that what you saw?" Both of them spoke up again and says, "No, we didn't. We didn't see any marks at all." Well, everybody was in a state of mind now, and they sings out, "The whole bilin' of 'em's frauds. Let's duck 'em. Let's drown 'em. Let's ride 'em on a rail." And everybody was whooping at once, and there was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer he jumps on the table and yells and says, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, hear me just a word. Just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look." That took them. "Hooray!" they all shouted, and was starting right off. But the lawyer and the doctor sung out, "Hold on, hold on! Collar all these 4 men and the boy, and fetch them along too." "We'll do it," they all shouted, "and if we don't find them marks, we'll lynch the whole gang." I was scared now, I tell you, but there warn't no getting away, you know. They gripped us all and marched us right along, straight for the graveyard, which was a mile and a half down the river, and the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough, and it was only 9 in the evening. As we went by our house, I wished I hadn't set Mary Jane out of town, because now if I could tip her the wink she'd light out and save me, and blow on our deadbeats. Well, we swarmed along down the river road, just carrying on like wildcats, and to make it more scary the sky was darking up, and the lightning beginning to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. This was the most awful trouble and most dangersome I ever was in, and I was kinder stunned. Everything was going so different from what I had allowed for. Instead of being fixed so I could take my own time if I wanted to, and see all the fun, and have Mary Jane at my back to save me and set me free when the close fit come, here was nothing in the world betwixt me and sudden death but just them tattoo marks. If they didn't find them... I couldn't bear to think about it, and yet somehow I couldn't think about nothing else. It got darker and darker, and it was a beautiful time to give the crowd the slip, but that big husky had me by the wrist. Hines, and a body might as well try to give Goliath the slip. He dragged me right along, he was so excited, and I had to run to keep up. When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. And when they got to the grave, they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted, but nobody hadn't thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway by the flicker of the lightning, and sent a man to the nearest house a half a mile off to borrow one. So they dug and dug like everything, and it got awful dark, and the rain started, and the wind swished and swooshed along, and the lightning come brisker and brisker, and the thunder boomed. But them people never took no notice of it, they was so full of this business. In 1 minute you could see everything and every face in that big crowd, and the shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave, and the next second the dark wiped it all out, and you couldn't see nothing at all. At last they got out the coffin and begun to unscrew the lid, and then another such crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was to scrooge in and get a sight you never see. And in the dark, that way, it was awful. Hines, he hurt my wrist dreadful pulling and tugging so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world, he was so excited and panting. All of a sudden the lightning let go a perfect sluice of white glare, and somebody sings out, "By the living jingo, here's the bag of gold on his breast." Hines let out a whoop like everybody else, and dropped my wrist and give a big surge to bust his way in and get a look, and the way I lit out and shinned for the road in the dark there ain't nobody can tell. I had the road all to myself, and I fairly flew. Leastways, I had it all to myself except the solid dark, and the now and then glares, and the buzzing of the rain, and the thrashing of the wind, and the splitting of the thunder. And sure as you are born, I did clip it along. When I struck the town, I see there warn't nobody out in the storm, so I never hunted for no back streets, but humped it straight through the main one. And when I begun to get towards our house, I aimed my eye and set it. No light there, the house all dark, which made me feel sorry and disappointed, I didn't know why. But at last, just as I was sailing by, flash comes the light in Mary Jane's window, and my heart swelled up sudden, like to bust, and the same second the house and all was behind me in the dark, and warn't ever going to be before me no more in this world.
She was the best girl I ever see, and had the most sand. The minute I was far enough above the town to see I could make the towhead, I begun to look sharp for a boat to borrow, and the first time the lightning showed me one that wasn't chained I snatched it and shoved. It was a canoe, and warn't fastened with nothing but a rope. The towhead was a rattling big distance off, away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose no time, and when I struck the raft at last I was so fagged I would have just laid down to blow and gasp if I could have afforded it, but I didn't. As I sprung aboard I sung out, "Out with you, Jim, and set her loose! Glory be to goodness we're shut of them!" Jim lit out and was coming for me with both arms spread, he was so full of joy, but when I glimpsed him in the lightning, my heart shot up in my mouth and went overboard backwards, for I forgot he was old King Lear and a drownded Arab all in one, and it most scared the livers and lights out of me. But Jim fished me out, and was going to hug me and bless me and so on, he was so glad I was back and we was shut of the king and the duke, but I says, "Not now! Have it for breakfast! Have it for breakfast! Cut loose and let her slide!" So in 2 seconds away we went a-sliding down the river, and it did seem so good to be free again and all by ourselves on the big river, and nobody to bother us. I had to skip around a bit and jump up and crack my heels a few times. I couldn't help it, but about the third crack I noticed a sound that I knowed mighty well, and held my breath and listened and waited, and sure enough, when the next flash busted out over the water, here they come, and just laying to their oars and making their skiff hum. It was the king and the duke. So I wilted right down onto the planks then and give up, and it was all I could do to keep from crying. End of chapter.
Chapter 30.
When they got aboard, the king went for me and shook me by the collar and says,
"Trying to give us the slip, was you pup? Tired of our company, hey?"
I says, "No, your majesty, we warn't. Please don't, your majesty."
"Quick then, and tell us what was your idea, or I'll shake the insides out of you."
"Honest, I tell you everything just as it happened, your majesty. The man that had a hold of me was very good to me, and kept saying he had a boy about as big as me that died last year, and he was sorry to see a boy in such a dangerous fix. And when they was all took by surprise by finding the gold and made a rush for the coffin, he lets go of me and whispers, 'Heel it now, or they'll hang you, sure.' And I lit out. It didn't seem no good for me to stay. I couldn't do nothing, and I didn't want to be hung if I could get away, so I never stopped running till I found the canoe, and when I got here I told Jim to hurry, or they'd catch me and hang me yet, and said I was afeard you and the Duke wasn't alive now, and I was awful sorry, and so was Jim, and was awful glad when we see you coming, and you may ask Jim if I didn't." Jim said it was so, and the king told him to shut up, and said,
"Oh, yes, it's mighty likely,"
and shook me up again, and said he reckoned he'd drown me. But the Duke says,
"Let go of the boy, you old idiot. Would you have done any different? Did you inquire around for him when you got loose? I don't remember it."
So the king let go of me, and begun to cuss that town and everybody in it. But the Duke says,
"You better a blame sight give yourself a good cussin', for you're the one that's entitled to it most. You ain't done a thing from the start that had any sense in it, except comin' out so cool and cheeky with that imaginary blue arrow mark. That was bright. It was right down bully, and it was the thing that saved us. For if it hadn't been for that, they'd a jailed us till them Englishmen's baggage come, and then the penitentiary, you bet. But that trick took 'em to the graveyard, and the gold done us a still bigger kindness, for if the excited fools hadn't let go all holts and made that rush to get a look, we'd a slept in our cravats tonight. Cravats warranted to wear, too, longer than we'd need 'em." They was still a minute, thinking. Then the king says, kind of absent-minded like, "And we reckon the niggers stole it."
That made me squirm. "Yes," says the Duke, kinder slow and deliberate and sarcastic, "we did." After about half a minute the king drawls out, "Leastways, I did." The Duke says the same way, "On the contrary, I did." The king kind of ruffles up and says, "Looky here, Bilgewater, what are you referring to?" The Duke says, pretty brisk, "When it comes to that, maybe you'll let me ask what was you referring to?" "Shucks," says the king, very sarcastic, "but I don't know. Maybe you was asleep and didn't know what you was about." The Duke bristles up now and says, "Oh, let up on this cussed nonsense. Do you take me for a blame fool? Don't you reckon I know who hid that money in that coffin?" "Yes, sir, I know you do know, because you done it yourself." "It's a lie!" and the Duke went for him. The king sings out, "Take your hands off. Let go of my throat. I take it all back." The Duke says, "Well, you just own up first that you did hide that money there, intending to give me the slip one of these days, and come back and dig it up and have it all to yourself." "Wait just a minute, Duke. Answer me this one question, honest and fair. If you didn't put the money there, say it, and I'll believe you, and take back everything I said." "You old scoundrel, I didn't, and you know I didn't. There now." "Well, then, I believe you. But answer me only just this one more. Now, don't get mad. Didn't you have it in your mind to hook the money and hide it?" The Duke never said nothing for a little bit. Then he says, "Well, I don't care if I did. I didn't do it, anyway. But you not only had it in mind to do it, but you done it." "I wished I'd never die if I'd done it, Duke, and that's honest. I won't say I warn't going to do it, because I was, but somebody got in ahead of me." "It's a lie. You done it, and you got to say you done it, or—" The king begun to gurgle, and then he gasped out, "Nuff, own up." I was very glad to hear him say that. It made me feel much more easier than what I was feeling before. So the Duke took his hands off and says, "If you ever deny it again, I'll drown you. It's well for you to set there and blubber like a baby. It's fitting for you, after the way you've acted. I never seen such an old ostrich for wanting to gobble everything, and I a-trusting you all the time, like you was my own father. You ought to been ashamed of yourself to stand by and hear it saddle on to a lot of poor niggers, and you never say a word for them. It makes me feel ridiculous to think I was soft enough to believe that rubbage. Cuss you, I can see now why you was so anxious to make up the deficit. You wanted to get what money I'd got out of the nonsuch in one thing or another, and scoop it all." The king says, timid and still a-snuffling, "Why, Duke, it was you that said make up the deficit. It warn't me." "Dry up. I don't want to hear no more out of you," says the Duke. "And now you see what you got by it. They got all their own money back, and all of ourn but a shekel or two besides. Go 'long to bed, and don't you defercit me no more deficits, long's you live." So the king sneaked into the wigwam and took to his bottle for comfort, and before long the Duke tackled his bottle, and so in about half an hour they was as thick as thieves again, and the tighter they got the lovinger they got, and went off a-snoring in each other's arms. They both got powerful mellow, but I noticed the king didn't get mellow enough to forget to remember to not deny about hiding the money back again. That made me feel easy and satisfied. Of course, when they got to snoring, we had a long gabble, and I told Jim everything. End of chapter.
Chapter 31.
We dasn't stop again at any town for days and days. Kept right along down the river. We was down south in the warm weather now, and a mighty long ways from home. We'd begun to come to trees with Spanish moss on them, hanging down from the limbs like long gray beards. It was the first I ever see it growin', and it made the woods look solemn and dismal. So now the frauds reckoned they was out of danger, and they begun to work the villages again. First they done a lecture on temperance, but they didn't make enough for them both to get drunk on. Then in another village they started a dancing school, but they didn't know no more how to dance than a kangaroo does, so the first prance they made the general public jumped in and pranced them out of town. Another time they tried to go at yellocution, but they didn't yellocute long till the audience got up and give them a solid good cussin' and made them skip out. They tackled missionarying and mesmerizing and doctoring and telling fortunes and a little everything, but they couldn't seem to have no luck. So at last they got just about dead broke, and laid about the raft as she floated along, thinking and thinking, and never saying nothing, by the half a day at a time, and dreadful blue and desperate. And at last they took a change and begun to lay their heads together in the wigwam and talk low and confidential 2 or 3 hours at a time. Jim and me got uneasy. We didn't like the look of it. We judged they was studying up some kind of worse deviltry than ever. We turned it over and over, and at last we made up our minds they was going to break into somebody's house or store, or was going into the counterfeit money business or something. So then we was pretty scared, and made up an agreement that we wouldn't have nothing in the world to do with such actions, and if we ever got the least show we would give them the cold shake and clear out and leave them behind. Well, early one morning we hid the raft in a good, safe place about 2 mile below a little bit of a shabby village named Pikesville, and the king he went ashore and told us all to stay hid, whilst he went up town and smelt around to see if anybody had got any wind of the Royal Nonesuch there yet. House to rob, you mean, says I to myself, and when you get through robbing it you'll come back here and wonder what has become of me and Jim and the raft, and you'll have to take it out in wondering. And he said if he weren't back by midday the Duke and me would know it was all right, and we was to come along. So we stayed where we was. The Duke he fretted and sweated around, and was in a mighty sour way. He scolded us for everything, and we couldn't seem to do nothing right. He found fault with every little thing. Something was a-brewin', sure. I was good and glad when midday come and no king. We could have a change anyway, and maybe a chance for the chance on top of it. So me and the Duke went up to the village and hunted around there for the king. And by we found him in the back room of a little low doggery, very tight, and a lot of loafers bullyragging him for sport, and he a-cussin' and a-threatenin' with all his might, and so tight he couldn't walk, and couldn't do nothin' to them. The Duke he begun to abuse him for an old fool, and the king begun to sass back, and the minute they was fairly at it I lit out and shook the reefs out of my hind legs, and spun down the river road like a deer, for I see our chance, and I made up my mind that it would be a long day before they ever see me and Jim again. I got down there all out of breath, but loaded up with joy, and sung out, "Set her loose, Jim, we're all right now." But there warn't no answer, and nobody come out of the wigwam. Jim was gone. I set up a shout, and then another one, and run this way and that in the woods, whooping and screeching, but it warn't no use. Old Jim was gone. Then I set down and cried. I couldn't help it, but I couldn't set still long. Pretty soon I went out on the road, trying to think what I better do, and I run across the boy walking, and asked him if he'd seen a strange nigger dressed so-and-so, and he says, "Yes." "Whereabouts?" says I. "Down to Silas Phelps' place, 2 mile below here. He's a runaway nigger, and they've got him. Was you looking for him?" "You bet I ain't. I run across him in the woods about an hour or 2 ago, and he said if I hollered he'd cut my livers out, and told me to lay down and stay where I was, and I done it. been there ever since, afeard to come out. Well, he says, you needn't be afeard no more, because they've got him. He run off from down south somewheres. It's a good job they got him. Well, I reckon. There's $200 reward on him. It's like picking up money out of the road. Yes, it is, and I could have had it if I'd been big enough. I see him first. Who nailed him? It was an old feller, a stranger, and he sold out his chance in him for $40, because he's got to go up the river and can't wait. Think of that now. You bet I'd wait if it was 7 year. That's me every time, says I. But maybe his chance ain't worth no more than that if he'll sell it so cheap. Maybe there's something ain't straight about it. But it is, though, straight as a string. I see the handbill myself. It tells all about him, to a dot. Paints him like a picture. Tells the plantation he's from, below New Orleans. No, sirree, Bob, there ain't no trouble about that speculation, you betcha. Say, give me a chaw of tobacco, won't you? I didn't have none, so he left. I went to the raft and set down in the wigwam to think, but I couldn't come to nothin'. I thought till I wore my head sore, but I couldn't see no way out of the trouble. After all this long journey, and after all we'd done for them scoundrels, here it was all come to nothin', and everything all busted up and ruined, because they could have the heart to serve Jim such a trick as that, and make him a slave again all his life, and amongst strangers, too, for $40 dirty. Once I said to myself it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he got to be a slave, and so I better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon give up that notion for two things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and ungratefulness for leaving her, and so she'd sell him straight down the river again. And if she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful nigger, and they'd make Jim feel it all the time. And so he'd feel honor and disgraced. And then think of me. It would get all around that Huck Finn helped a nigger to get his freedom, and if I was ever to see anybody from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he don't want to take no consequences of it. Thinks as long as he can hide, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience went to grinding me, and the more wicked and low down and ornery I got to feeling. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden that here was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's nigger that hadn't ever done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one that's always on the lookout, and ain't a-going to allow no such miserable doin's to go only just so fur and no further. I most dropped in my tracks, I was so scared. Well, I tried the best I could to kinder soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, and so I warn't so much to blame. But something inside of me kept saying, there was a Sunday school, you could 'a' gone to it, and if you'd 'a' done it, they'd 'a' learnt you there that people that acts as I've been acting about that nigger goes to everlasting fire. It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of a boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down. But the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It warn't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart warn't right. It was because I warn't square. It was because I was playin' double. I was lettin' on to give up sin, but away inside of me I was holdin' on to the biggest one of all. I was tryin' to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing, and go right to that nigger's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. So I was full of trouble, full as I could be, and didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea, and I says I'll go and write the letter, and then see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing, the way I felt as light as a feather right straight off, and my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and set down and wrote, "Miss Watson, your runaway nigger Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send. Huck Finn." I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I had ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and set there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And went on thinking, and got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the night time, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we are floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his'n, instead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping, and see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was, and such like times, and would always call me honey, and pet me and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful, and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling, because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, "All right, then, I'll go to hell," and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head, and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brung up to it, and the other warn't. For a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Then I set to thinking over how to get at it, and turned over some considerable many ways in my mind, and at last fixed up a plan that suited me. So then I took the bearings of a woody island that was down the river a piece, and as soon as it was fairly dark I crept out with my raft and went for it, and hid it there, and then turned in. I slept the night through, and got up before it was light, and had my breakfast, and put on my store clothes, and tied up some others and one thing or another in a bundle, and took the canoe and cleared for shore. I landed below where I judged was Phelps' place, and hid my bundle in the woods, and then filled up the canoe with water, and loaded rocks into her and sunk her where I could find her again when I wanted her, about a quarter of a mile below a little steam sawmill that was on the bank. Then I struck up the road, and when I passed the mill I see a sign on it, Phelps's Sawmill, and when I come to the farmhouses 200 or 300 yards further along, I kept my eyes peeled, but didn't see nobody around, although it was good daylight now. But I didn't mind, because I didn't want to see nobody just yet. I only wanted to get the lay of the land. According to my plan, I was going to turn up there from the village, not from below, so I just took a look and shoved along straight for town. Well, the very first man I see when I got there was the Duke. He was sticking up a bill for the Royal Nonsuch, 3-night performance, like that other time. They had the cheek, them frauds. I was right on him before I could shirk. He looked astonished, and says, "Hello, where'd you come from?" Then he says, kind of glad and eager, "Where's the raft? Got her in a good place?" I says, "Why, that's just what I was going to ask your grace." Then he didn't look so joyful, and says, "What was your idea for asking me?" he says. "Well," I says, "when I see the king in that doggery yesterday, I says to myself, we can't get him home for hours, till he's soberer, so I went a-loafing around town to put in the time and wait. A man up and offered me 10 cents to help him pull a skiff over the river and back to fetch a sheep, and so I went along. But when we was dragging him to the boat, and the man left me a hold of the rope and went behind him to shove him along, he was too strong for me and jerked loose and run, and we after him. We didn't have no dog, and so we had to chase him all over the country till we tired him out. We never got him till dark. Then we fetched him over, and I started down for the raft. When I got there and see it was gone, I says to myself, they got into trouble and had to leave, and they've took my nigger, which is the only nigger I've got in the world, and now I'm in a strange country and ain't got no property no more, no nothing, and no way to make my living. So I sat down and cried. I slept in the woods all night. But what did become of the raft then? And Jim, poor Jim?"
"Blamed if I know. That is, what's become of the raft. That old fool has made a trade and got $40, and when we found him in the doggery the loafers had matched $half with him and got every cent but what he'd spent for whiskey. And when I got him home late last night and found the raft gone, we said, 'That little rascal has stole our raft and shook us, and run down the river.'"
"I wouldn't shake my nigger, would I? The only nigger I had in the world, and the only property?"
"We never thought of that. Fact is, I reckon we come to consider him our nigger. Yes, we did consider him so. Goodness knows we had trouble enough for him. So when we see the raft was gone and we flat broke, there wa'n't anything for it but to try the Royal Nonsuch another shake. And I've pegged along ever since, dry as a powder horn. Where's that 10 cents? Give it here." I had considerable money, so I give him 10 cents, but begged him to spend it for something to eat and give me some, because it was all the money I had, and I hadn't had nothing to eat since yesterday. He never said nothing. The next minute he whirls on me and says, "Do you reckon that nigger would blow on us? We'd skin him if he done that."
"How can he blow? Ain't he run off?"
"No. That old fool sold him, and never divided with me, and the money's gone."
"Sold him?" I says, and begun to cry. "Why, he was my nigger, and that was my money. Where is he? I want my nigger."
"Well, you can't get your nigger, that's all, so dry up your blubberin'. Looky here, do you think you'd venture to blow on us? Blamed if I think I'd trust you. Why, if you was to blow on us—" He stopped, but I never see the Duke look so ugly out of his eyes before. I went on a-whimperin' and says, "I don't want to blow on nobody, and I ain't got no time to blow nohow. I got to turn out and find my nigger." He looked kind of bothered, and stood there with his bills fluttering on his arm, thinking, and wrinkling up his forehead. At last he says, "I'll tell you something. We got to be here 3 days. If you'll promise you won't blow and won't let the nigger blow, I'll tell you where to find him." So I promised, and he says, "A farmer by the name of Silas F—" And then he stopped. You see, he started to tell me the truth, but when he stopped that way and begun to study and think again, I reckon he was changing his mind. And so he was. He wouldn't trust me.
he wanted to make sure of having me out of the way the whole 3 days. So pretty soon he says, "The man that bought him is named Abram Foster, Abram G. Foster, and he lives 40 mile back here in the country, on the road to Lafayette." "All right," I says. "I can walk it in 3 days, and I'll start this very afternoon." "No, you won't. You'll start now, and don't you lose any time about it, neither, nor do any gabbling by the way. Just keep a tight tongue in your head and move right along, and then you won't get into trouble with us, do you hear?" That was the order I wanted, and that was the one I played for. I wanted to be left free to work my plans. "So clear out," he says, "and you can tell Mr. Foster whatever you want to. Maybe you can get him to believe that Jim is your nigger. Some idiots don't require documents. Leastways, I've heard there's such down south here. And when you tell him the handbill and the reward's bogus, maybe he'll believe you when you explain to him what the idea was for getting him out. Go along now, and tell him anything you want to, but mind you don't work your jaw any between here and there." So I left, and struck for the back country. I didn't look around, but I kinder felt like he was watching me. But I knowed I could tire him out at that. I went straight out in the country as much as a mile before I stopped. Then I doubled back through the woods towards Phelps's. I reckoned I better start in on my plans straight off without fooling around, because I wanted to stop Jim's mouth till these fellows could get away. I didn't want no trouble with their kind. I'd seen all I wanted to of them, and wanted to get entirely shut of them. End of chapter.